Hello there, I'm Sakaven, and welcome to the MTG Raw Talk podcast, the show where myself and my co-host, PrinceOfAsphodel, talk about cEDH, the optimized side of everyone's favorite Magic the Gathering format. No edits, no cuts, just our raw opinions as two experienced players. If you would take a moment to click that like button and subscribe for further content, we would greatly appreciate it. And with that, let's hear it. So, coming on today for our first episode, we're going to be running over the banning of Hullbreacher, our thoughts on that, and then we'll get on with general introductions for us and what we plan to do in the future. So, Hullbreacher, what a card, right?
Yeah, it was interesting because I remember my first thoughts when it was spoiled was, this is literally a strict upgrade to a card that they already banned in this format, which is not something that I could have said about any other card in the history of this format. So it was a really interesting experiment. And of course, I'm talking about Leovold here.
Yeah.
They banned him because he was too powerful as a commander. And he was also 3 mana like Hullbreacher, but he had 3 different colors. So now we get Hullbreacher, who not only has Flash and does the same thing Leovold does, but it is way easier to cast.
And he
And
adds mana.
if nothing else, it served as a pretty interesting experiment to what happens when when we get this sort of functional reprint of a card that's already been banned.
Yeah, that was a big citation in Wizards' article on the banning, was that they've already banned Leovold. And they said they still have their eye on Narset and Notion Thief. So, what do you think the
Fascinating.
card did to the cEDH meta right when it was spoiled and printed?
Um, so with cards like Hullbreacher that have an effect that's just really relevant to the format, the way that it warps the format tends to not be very specific just because the card is just good. Like, for example, if Prophet of Krufix got unbanned today, it wouldn't exactly skyrocket an archetype, I think. It would just simply be played everywhere because it's just a quality card. And I think that's sort of the case that was going on with Hullbreacher. But some notable examples of ways that it did specifically change the format are, I think, decks that already made heavy use of wheels got a
Yeah.
little stronger because they had another weapon to pair with it, one that was cheaper than Notion Thief, um, less vulnerable than Narset, and I mean cheaper than Smothering Tithe as well. So that was cool.
Yeah.
Additionally, it hurt the decks that revolved around card draw in order to snowball to their win. We're talking like Selvala, Edric, you know, 4-color Rashmi, the little the ping archetype
Yeah, and
with
arguably it
Curiosity.
even hurt Thrasio's mid-range strategies, not being able to draw any
Yeah,
extra.
and I don't have a lot of experience with those matchups, honestly, but what I do know is a lot of those decks also played Hullbreacher just because it was such a good card and it stopped everyone else around them too. So because of that, I don't think its impact was enormous in the way that it swung the format in the favor of some archetypes rather than others, just because everyone was playing the darn thing, because it's at least a little good against every deck.
Yeah, I know that every deck that couldn't play it, namely, I know in my Selvala list I added 3 or 4 extra removal spells just to deal with that one threat that would be tutored for on a regular basis, if any draw based strategies at the table.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I've been known to pilot Edric every once in a while, and I didn't play it when Hullbreacher was around, not specifically because of Hullbreacher, but just because I was trying other things. But I definitely would have had to put more focus on removing Hullbreacher when it just destroys the entire strategy that I'm going for. So in that way, it was a little oppressive towards some decks, for sure.
Yeah, I felt a little more secure after the printing of Solitude, but then Hullbreacher was banned, so I never really got to see what that would have done. But now it did get banned, and the meta didn't really the meta didn't change, but I know that deck building certainly did change. People, from as small a change as I have one extra slot in my deck now to, oh, I should probably take out some of these extra wheels and creature tutors and focus on my combo, be that ad nauseum or the underworld breach.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the banning of Hullbreacher affected deck slots more than actual decks. There are
Yeah.
a few of those decks that were more oppressed than others by Hullbreacher for sure. But really, those decks were still seeing play. They just needed that one or two extra removal pieces to ensure that they could get Hullbreacher off the table more consistently.
Yeah.
It's kind of that same dynamic I had touched on a little earlier, where just Hullbreacher is just a generally good card, so it just kind of went everywhere. And when it was banned, everyone just kind of sighed and took it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't see much complaint. Although that's at the top of the discussion. At the bottom of the discussion in the local scene, I've heard a lot of complaint about it from competitive players. The old used phrase, "It died for the sins of the casual players," based on the reasons
Yeah.
pointed out by Wizards. And like personally, I do consider that card to be on the types of cards and the power level that should be banned in Commander. And as a cEDH player, I'll use whatever I have available to me to play the game. If a card gets banned, that just means I get to build a new deck or build it in a different way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so, and I'm sure this has been completely overstated already on this platform, but the reason that it was banned was mainly that players could pick it up out of their Commander Legends pack, stick it in, their new deck that they built that often includes cards like Windfall, been printed a million times. See that interaction, and in their head they realize, oh, this is really powerful. But then they play, a normal game of Commander with it, and it doesn't get stopped, and instead it draws the game out to a halt because sure they have all this mana, but they don't have any more than 7 cards, and those 7 cards aren't going to win the game immediately in that at that level of play. So it led to countless complaints and sighs and a lot of anger towards the card, which probably resulted in the ban.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm thinking about the more casual players. And I think for our purposes, there are really two different ways of looking at the banning and whether or not it was positive or negative. And you can look at what it did to the actual meta, whether it was good for the cEDH metagame to have this card leave the format. And then you can look at it from the angle of the precedent that banning Hullbreacher sets and whether that's positive and negative. And I don't think there's an objectively correct way to view either one. I know that I, for example, see it as a positive on one side and a negative on the other.
Yeah,
So
I I think it balanced out the meta a little bit, and it opened up some strategies we want to see, and erased the small number of non games it could have caused or did cause. One of the longest games ever recorded was because of Hullbreacher from playing with Power's site, and another game I heard on their podcast a week ago. Someone resolved a Hullbreacher plus wheel, and the table just scooped and shuffled up. They did not want to play that game. And then, as far as the precedent goes, yeah, now you can think, okay, whatever card requires responsibility to play without ruining the game state, that's now up to be a target for banning, even if it's not necessarily the most powerful thing in the world, or it doesn't win the game by itself. But if it can hit the table and ruin the game without someone having to deliberately plan to do so, that's a really dangerous spot to be in for a card in Commander. Like
that's really interesting.
they haven't banned
Um,
Apocalypse. It's because anyone in their right mind would look at Apocalypse and think, I don't want this in my Commander deck. You have to have a lot of premeditation to play a card like that, as opposed to Hullbreacher, which is just like, hey, I'm this innocent little Merfolk pirate. You can put me in your Merfolk deck or your pirate deck. I'm gonna make your opponents not draw cards and give you mana. It's pretty cool, right? It's unassuming.
Yeah, that's exactly where my mind had gone when you defined that reason for banning Hull Breachers. That sounds a lot like land destruction. But the problem is land destruction isn't good on its own if you don't plan for that stage where you actually need to be responsible for winning the game afterward. Because someone could accidentally, I don't know, like possibility storm into a wheel when you have Hull Breacher there, and now all of a sudden everyone hates you for having that Hull Breacher, and now the game is all weird.
Yeah.
You didn't plan for that. Whereas if you destroy everyone's lands with an Armageddon per se, um, that was on you. You put that in your deck with that in mind, with that exact interaction in mind. So now it's your problem to kind of fix the mess.
Yeah, it's in your interest, your best interest to fix the mess as well. You don't want to play a long non-game either. At least not any
And
properly cEDH minded person.
that premise makes a lot of sense for banning something in casual. And in competitive, I didn't really see it that way. Just because there's the problem of where you draw the line once you start banning things for certain reasons. And I know this isn't fully applicable because this card wasn't banned for competitive reasons. It was banned for casual reasons. But it's I think this format's strengths over that of any other competitive format is that you're basically just allowed to play with anything as long as it doesn't take away from other people's experience by a significant margin. And the banning of things like Hullbreacher, even more so of Paradox Engine, in my opinion, but
Yeah.
Hullbreacher reinvigorated this idea because it's been more recent, is that I don't think these cards, when they existed in our format, really crossed that line of taking away that many other players' experiences from the game, more so than other cards in our format already do. Like I want this to be a format, and I think a lot of cEDH players agree with this sentiment that where a card has to do something really, really egregious in order to deserve that banhammer. Because what that banhammer means is it represents a constant vigilance of someone over the format saying, okay, well, you had your fun, but you've been winning a little too much, so we're just going to get rid of you. And I think that's a really dangerous mentality to have in a format that thrives off of just being the junkyard where everything is kind of legal and
Yeah.
just like everyone brings whatever they want to the table and there's just a big shootout and everyone has fun with that. And those are kind of opposite ideas. And I know that there isn't really anyone watching over the cEDH format making decisions based off of that, but that's what a lot of bans in Commander do tend to feel like. And as cEDH keeps growing, the more things get banned because of casual, the more players that don't play casual end up being affected. And that's why there's so much outcry every time something gets banned in Commander. The players from our side of things, the strictly competitive folk, you start hearing more and more complaints from them just because there's more and more of us. And I think it's fair to consider consequences of banning something through the eyes of a cEDH player now, just because our population has grown so much over the last few years.
Yeah, and there are several members of the advisory group who are in that mindset, at least partially, but they don't have enough power right now to really influence those sorts of things. Um, but yeah, if Hullbreacher and Paradox Engine were banned for the exact same reason. Like, sure, they were used in strictly competitive games to great effect, and they diversified. Well, in the case of Paradox Engine, it diversified the format in an environment where Flash was legal, and Hullbreacher like caused a lot of interactions that were interesting. I think that Hullbreacher was a bit more egregious than Paradox Engine, but they were both banned because yes, they did take away the play experience of other players by a huge amount, but only at casual tables, which it's still most of the tables.
Right.
By like a player could use their Paradox Engine to go off, play a whole bunch of spells, and not actually end the game, leaving the other players to draw, do one thing, and pass the turn, or sit there and watch the person spend like 20 minutes taking game actions, like sort of unsure of the road ahead. The same thing happened with Hullbreacher. They could play it, shut down everything, and if their hand doesn't go anywhere, then no one goes anywhere.
Yeah, and it's interesting now that we're drawing so many parallels between Paradox Engine and Hullbreacher to think that really the effect that doesn't let players do a certain thing that got cards banned. Because I remember a comment on Reddit that I read earlier this month about someone who called the banning of Paradox Engine as soon as it was released. But it wasn't until an entire year later, after they had given up and actually purchased the thing,
Yeah.
that they banned it a week later. Which that's unfortunate. You hate to hear stories like that. But the reason I bring this up is because I think this person was wrong in assuming that Paradox Engine was ban worthy when it was released, because it wasn't a stacks piece that stopped opponents from doing anything. It wasn't until Urza was released and Urza created this atmosphere of playing all of these artifacts that stopped your opponent's lands from untapping and all of these similar effects that just happened to win with Paradox Engine, that all of a sudden now Paradox Engine was in the spotlight. Once you're messing with other people's things, kind of like Hullbreacher was naturally, that's when toxic bans start happening, and that's not something I had really considered before. But if Ursa had not existed, Paradox Engine might still be legal right now.
Yeah, that does hold true for those cards. The same with Leovold. Um, and then there are cards they a common thing they say is they when they hit the table, the game revolves around that card now. Like it has been the explanation for the Primeval Titan ban,
Right.
the Sylvan Primordial
And
ban.
the argument for oh yikes, 6-drop blue spell binds with something you can bounce two things.
Oh,
Dread Jedi Navigator.
yeah, Deadeye Navigator.
My apologies. Yeah, that's what people cite as the reason for why they want that card banned as well. It's just it creates an immediate presence that affects the entire game going forward.
Yeah, and so I guess what I'm seeing from the rules committee is their desire to keep the format in a place where no one card influences the game to that great an extent. But it's sort of the reason we see more frequent bans now is because there's sort of a contrast with Wizards' desire to print new and more exciting cards.
Yeah,
So I don't know exactly where that discourse is going, but I'm okay with Hullbreacher not being here, and it's an interesting metagame right now. I just listened
yeah.
to.
So before I closed off my thoughts about what I thought about the precedent of banning. Oh,
Oh yeah,
sorry, you started cutting out there.
no, it's okay. You can go on the precedent.
Yeah, I said before I wanted to close my thoughts on the precedent of banning. I didn't mention that there were like two sides of the argument, and I hadn't really touched up on what I thought it did to the meta as a whole and whether or not it was actually good for the game or not.
Oh yeah,
And I'd like to mention that since it was banned due to what kind of is a different format than ours in a way, not literally, but definitely through other means, then whether or not the banning of Hullbreacher was good for a metagame or bad would have been completely by accident.
yeah. It's a side
And
effect.
I actually think this somewhat had a positive effect, luckily. I don't know about you.
Well,
It
yeah,
sounds like you see it as positive as well.
I do. Yeah, as I've been mainlining Selvala right now because um, I really enjoy her interaction against Thassa's Oracle and the ease at which she can win the game after Ashaya was printed. And Hullbreacher was my greatest nemesis between its printing and its banning. So for me, it's a positive because it opens up slots in my deck and makes my strategy look more appealing at the table.
Yeah, this is actually a really cool dynamic because you main a deck that doesn't play blue. So you are on the side of things where Hullbreacher was a tool to use against you.
Yeah,
And it's a positive because it further unlocked the power of decks like yours and led to more format diversity, right?
yeah, like mine and Selvala Brostorm, the mono green Selvala, same deal with that one. Marwyn, any green based combo deck was severely destroyed by Hullbreacher because the way that they spiral into a win is by drawing cards, an excess of cards.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah, that makes
primary
sense.
thread for any green deck is make a lot of mana, turn that mana into card draw, turn that card draw into a game winning state.
Well, on the other hand, I'm a player who loves to play Thrasios and Tymna variants. I've been on Consult Scepter Thrasios back since it was Paradox Scepter Thrasios. I've tried Flash Hulk variants, more
Mm-hmm.
mid-range variants, and So Hullbreacher was a card that was basically always in my Thrasios and Tymna lists. And it wasn't until just a few days ago that I was really thinking about what the effects have been of removing Hullbreacher from this deck. And they actually haven't been all that negative from a play point of view like I would have thought. Just because Hullbreacher is not as good of a win condition as Notion Thief. It's a lot better as a stacks piece,
Yeah.
which helps draw the game out a little more. But oftentimes you can put Notion Thief and Windfall in your deck and see that as a type of win condition. Your opponents end up with 0 cards in their decks and you end up with 20, and from there it's so easy to snowball. But when your opponents end up with 0 cards and you end up with like 4 or 5 and a bunch of mana, your victory is way less certain. And so it was almost annoying in a way to have to put Hullbreacher in my deck when I knew it wasn't really a win condition. It was just a stacks piece that was so good that I was obligated to play it.
Yeah, it's a really good way of saying it.
And so that's interesting. It's interesting to see both sides of this because I could imagine that the banning of Hullbreacher from the point of view of someone who plays decks that are more like yours would be pretty positive. But I would have ventured to guess that someone who lost Hullbreacher in a deck like Four Color, Thrasios, and Tymna, insert X combo here, would have been pretty bummed about it. And honestly, as one of those players, I'm looking back at it and being like, yeah, I'm honestly not that upset. This deck was good before, it's good now. Sure, I lost a good hate piece against other people, but other people lost a decent hate piece against me. It's like I didn't really lose much.
Yeah, it just sort of balanced out in the end. Your position didn't really change. So if you think about
Exactly. And that's why I
that,
think it
the uh, the blue the blue four color decks running that ran Hullbreacher, they didn't change their position, whereas the decks like mine got a little boost that increase. It was a general increase for the format. It wasn't a bad thing.
yeah. Yeah, that's why I think the metagame didn't actually get hit too hard by the banning of Hullbreacher, which is a positive for me because that's not exactly what happened with Paradox Engine. There were a few strategies that straight up died.
Yeah. All right.
But kind of to close off this thought, I wanted to point out the fact that I didn't see this ban as that negative of a thing from just a player's perspective, so that I could farther accent the point that I really don't like it from viewing the precedent that it sets. Basically to show off that I'm not biased, that I actually am kind of happy that I don't have this in my format anymore. But even so, I really don't want a card that I think is very healthy for this format to be banned for the same reasons that Hullbreacher was banned, which
Yeah.
is why I'm a little split on this banning. I think we were lucky that this was the card that got hit over other things, but I would I would really like to see this not become the norm for a commander, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. Moving on again. I'm Sakaven and this is Prince. Been playing for a while now. I got into Magic after playing the Pokemon TCG competitively until 2016. I got into Magic around 2015 or whenever, right with the release of Origins, and Prince and I were modern players for a long time.
Yep.
I remember my good old Titan Shift deck that I played throughout that season. You were off and on between like Burn. I remember Black White Tokens, right?
That was before Burn, I think.
Yeah, that was before Burn.
After I moved on to Burn in Modern, I just knew that I had a tier 1 deck, so I didn't do too much shifting. I moved over to Titan Shift for some tournaments, and
Yeah,
I did try out other strategies that would tackle the meta better, such as Mono White Martyr, but I wasn't as good as piloting them, and I just didn't feel comfortable playing a deck that wasn't intrinsically powerful like Burn was. So I usually ended up going back to that as my strategy.
I remember GP Vegas with the Hogak legal. I
Yeah,
had
that was kind of awesome.
that was kind of awesome. I had my Naya Titan Shift deck with Naya the Reliquary and Field of the Dead and Path to Exile, which was pretty effective in handling Hogak. Missed day 2 by 1 game. Very frustrated. You were on that mono red prowess deck.
Yeah, but just for the side events.
Oh,
I
just
was
for a
on
sec.
Burn for the main event.
Yeah, okay. That was an interesting event. And that we had our fledgling cEDH decks with us because at our local game store, they had paid, price-supported commander pods, and did not end up separating between competitive and casual. So you and I would remember we would go in there and both sign up for the same pod. Usually the winner was one of us. There were other cEDH players though there as well.
Yeah, those made for some of the best games when we had really competitive pods, which unfortunately wasn't super normal at our game store. Although they did make a cool move when they tried to split pods between those that went infinite and those that didn't. It didn't draw the most consistent line ever, but it did help and make it so that the pods weren't so badly unbalanced.
Yeah. I remember my commander introduction was Alicia, who smiles at death. I remember playing that against your Teysa, right?
Oh gosh, yeah, I had forgotten about Teysa.
Yeah. You had like one of the original infinite combos.
Yeah, maybe. I remember it being pretty good, but I remember it doing really random things and then just hoping that they melded well together, which they ended up doing. Mostly it was sacrifice themed, destroy other permanents. You know, a lot of the things you'd expect Black White to do, but this was back when we were really unrefined as commander players.
Yeah, and I was putting things like ah Archdemon of Archfiend of Depravity. Is that the it was like a 2/6 that stole your opponent's lands as a cumulative upkeep.
I don't even
But
remember
it costs
that. I
like
am not good at remembering card names that are
it
not
costs,
relevant in my format.
yeah, it costs like 8 mana, but Alicia could cheat it in. It was a graveyard based reanimation deck. And then eventually I brought my preference for Gruul over from Modern and built good old Omnath, Locus of Rage. And that's when I think both of us realized we started to optimize our commander decks against each other to
I
begin
think
with, but
so.
also in the meta at the time.
I think that is the turning point in my story as well, which is interesting. I share a lot of Sakaven's history here. We started as Pokemon players, moved on to Magic, started in Modern because we liked the competitive aspect, kind of moved to Commander as a side thing while we waited for Modern pods to fire at our local game store.
Yeah.
And I remember that when I had designed the deck that I called Creatureless Omnath, that was the first time I had paid really close attention to optimization, exactly what the deck wanted to do, and then everything that detracted rather than added to that strategy, regardless of whether or not it was good, I started cutting. So I remember I had this identity that I wanted to work toward, and I think this story is pretty relevant, so I'm going to spend a minute or two on this one
Sounds good.
because both of us moved on to Omnath right as we were going into cEDH. And the reasons I think were really interesting. And the Omnath we're talking about, by the way, because there's a bunch of them, is the expensive one, the one that's just red green. It
Yeah.
has landfall, so whenever a land enters the battlefield, it makes a 5/5 token. And the reason I really liked this was because your ramp engine and your win condition were one and the same, which means you didn't have to spend slots on these are the cards that kill people and slots on these are what I need to get to the point where I can start killing people. Because of Omnath's ability, you could take a card like Rampant Growth, and here was my philosophy: is I want every card that is Rampant Growth in this deck. Then I want every card that is almost as good as Rampant Growth in this deck. And then I want every card that is not at that level, but like the third closest to Rampant Growth, and I'm putting those in the deck. Because a Rampant Growth gets you to 4 mana rather than 3 mana at the start of your fourth turn. At the start of your fifth turn, it can get you to 7 mana, which means you can cast Omnath on turn 3. It wasn't always the best play actually. I would usually wait till turn 4 so I could cast Omnath and a Rampant Growth effect to get the token.
Yeah.
I remember the play patterns for this. But basically, I had never streamlined a deck so much to where I said, this is what I want to be doing. I don't want anything that has to do with what this isn't. And the reason I called it Creatureless Omnath is because I felt that creatures were just not that necessary. It wasn't literally creatureless.
It
There's our
had
creature
like wood
rampant
elves,
growth side
right?
of the tribe. Wood elves I would run. I would run Avenger of Zendikar just because he's so good in casual pods. And in
Yeah.
fact, I even ran Tooth and Nail so I could fetch out Avenger of Zendikar and Perforos as a win condition. That was
Yeah.
really
I
fun.
remember that.
Yeah, and so basically that's when my philosophy of deck building and deck playing started becoming much more organized. And it was at around this time where we started winning so many pods. First me, and then actually it was just me at this point, because by the time you were on it, we were already at this next stage, which is at the point where I realized that there were some people that were playing decks that were so good that Omnath could not keep up. I said I want a strategy that can both win without telegraphing too much and be able to interact with what my opponents are doing uh, at similar times. And so John and we would pair up in the same pods. So to gather research and talk about play patterns and all this stuff. But he actually adopted Omnath and was the more proactive deck, whereas I moved on to Una, which was my first experiment in this format because it had interaction, it could go infinite, and it could do so without telegraphing what it was going to do too much. And that's kind of when it all went uphill for us, I guess.
Yeah, it did start going uphill. I remember I brought my ramp expertise from Modern, and I'd always been a fan of proactive decks. I always liked getting an effect in play that would allow me to win the game at some point in the future, and protecting it and building off of it as quickly as possible. I remember each card I would add to Omnath that would keep making it better and better and better. Eventually, the Tooth and Nail package switched from Xenagos and Avenger of Zendikar to
Yeah.
Kiki Jiki and Zealous Conscripts.
Right. Because
And
that
I
was the
would,
game.
yeah, and that would be the end point, because I reasoned in my head, I'm like, this costs less mana overall. These cards are good on their own, and they win the game outright. They don't need to be supported by my previous game plan. And we sort of got into the mix of cEDH, because some players at the store were already in cEDH. They already played optimized decks. We had a Shuffle Hulk player, I remember. We had plenty of artifact-based storm decks.
Yeah, like Idris
Yeah.
and Mim the Pain Artist.
Yep.
We had a Jace Rins Prodigy player,
Mm-hmm.
but he stopped playing as much when we were really at our peak.
Eventually, I moved from Omnath to Ruikthar, because I remember I had Ruikthar in my deck, and every time it hit the table, it had such a great impact, and it was very favorable for me that I decided to rework it and use Ruikthar as a commander. Now that deck was
And yeah, alternatively, Omnath, if you tap out for him, has no effect on the board, whereas Rurikthar does.
yeah, he has an immediate and powerful effect. And another draw to Ruikthar over Omnath was that I could play the more efficient and powerful ramp in the form of mana dorks rather than just land
Yes.
introduction spells.
This is a really good example of transitioning from a powerful deck that is not cEDH to a powerful deck that is in the cEDH format. That's actually really cool to point out, is you go from a commander that needs other cards to become a good win condition to a commander that by himself affects the entire state of the game. You move from a safer but slower form of ramp to a slightly riskier but faster form of ramp to get places faster. I hadn't really realized this because you transitioned straight from Gruul to Gruul, but from casual to competitive in deck lists.
Yeah, I did. I loved working with those colors. I didn't want to leave the colors as much as I wanted to improve myself overall. I kind of wonder, where was it when and where was it when you realized that you wanted to switch from Una up to Tasigur, which was your next step, right?
Well, yes, it was. And it wasn't too different from any time I get the urge to switch from one deck to another, which is just I want to experiment with the efficiency that this deck seems to have. And first, that was the color green for me because I know it had ramp that was just so fast compared to the budget artifact that I had in Una, because proxies aren't allowed in our LGS, at least not back here in Colorado. Sakaven has since moved, but they had the greatest system back in the day of you just paid $5 for F&M entry, and each time you won a pod, you got a pack, which you could in turn in for store credit, which we sometimes saved up and bought a card that we needed. It was really, really chill.
Yeah, it was a good
Um,
weekly event to go to.
yeah, yeah. So that almost incentivized us to grow in power because we were like, well, we don't need to win every single game, but I at least want a chance to win every single game. And if the luck doesn't doesn't get there, or if I make a mistake or two, that's okay because I wanted to know that I had a deck that was powerful enough to compete with what whoever sat across the table from me. Oh, and to the side and diagonally
Yeah,
because 4-person pots.
yeah. Across is
um,
relative.
so I remember in I was this was obviously the decision to switch to Thrasios was influenced by Labman Cameron because he was the one who really popularized this archetype. And when I was looking at it really closely, I said, "Oh, this is actually a commander that wins when you have infinite mana." And this is why I really liked Una because I had two combos in there that made infinite mana. And once I did that, I was set. I could just cast Una, and then X equals 1,000 on each of my opponents, and then they lose their libraries, and I win the game. And that was really cool because all I needed to do was make infinite mana. I didn't have multiple goals in order to win the game. I didn't have make creatures, buff them, attack. I didn't have make infinite mana, then go tutor for a spell, and then use that spell to win the game. It was just you make infinite mana, yes, you're good. Boom, game's over. And that's what I really, really liked. Like I said, at this point, I was really valuing efficiency. And this is when I started valuing subtlety as well. And in Tasigur, I saw this is a commander that can win in the exact same way that Una can with the banana ball combo, as they call it. It's a little more convoluted, but it's the same idea of when you make infinite mana, you have the game basically. And I said, this is basically Una, but with green. I really want to try this. And I did, and it was cool. And I realized both the pros and the cons of adding another color to your deck. Sometimes you just get a little color screwed, but other times you just get to play with a higher concentration of more powerful cards. That was very cool, and that's the exact same logic I had for Thrasios and Tymna. I saw that other people were using them to good success. I said I kind of want to see what it means to add white to this deck, and it's a strategy that's employing the same tools and tactics I've been using of make infinite mana win the game. So let's try it out.
Yep, and that was it. Was also it kind of introduced you to the thought of in injecting a value engine to your deck that can be activated multiple times every turn or during your opponent's turns or give you
Oh,
advantage
that's a good point.
at other times in the
That's a
game
good
than
point.
just your main phase.
Yeah, because Una was not that. Una was Una sometimes does get cast in cEDH and works as a beat stick, and she's fantastic for that when no one's ready for a 5/5 flyer, just hitting them over and over again. But she doesn't get used in the way that Thrasios and Tasigur get used, which is if you have nothing else to do, you can just cast them, and then they are your value engines. And while I've been successful with decks that don't do that, it was really cool to be introduced to that idea. Just like Sakaven says, it's you get a new perspective on what it feels like to play with these other strategies that do things a little bit differently. And that was really cool for sure.
Yeah, and then we both when we realized what cEDH was for me, I think it was when Theros Beyond Death came out that I realized that cEDH was its own environment with at the top level with a meta with established archetypes. Because I remember at the time I had brewed my sort of incredible but very crazy Multani Yavimaya's Avatar Storm deck, mono green Storm deck. It relied on the power of Sasaya and Multani's ability to fill your hand with lands to multiply your mana exponentially and eventually win the game with a hurricane. Um, that deck, that was sort of my introduction to combo and storm and going really fast without disrupting my opponents as much. And I think
Yeah, I remember this deck was the bane of all casuals.
it was. You could not beat it with anything that wasn't a combo.
But
I
what's even funnier is that wasn't the goal when you had built it. You had accidentally stumbled upon the Society combo.
Yeah, I think I was like sitting at home one day and I just thought, huh, what if I just build a deck that this guy who's his power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control and lands in your graveyard, and he has built-in recursion that costs less overall than the commander tax. So what if I do that and just put a bunch of ramp spells into it? And then I realized something as I was playing it. I could cast spells like Rishkar's Expertise to draw through my deck. And I don't remember how Sasaya got into the deck. For the life of me, I can't remember. But when
Neither can I.
I was goldfishing and I flipped her, and then I realized my ramp spells, my rampant growths, my untapped rampant growths, things like Nature's Lore, they became rituals, and so that was the moment I realized, oh, this could be a lot more than I expected it to be when I set out on this project. So when Theros Beyond Death came out, a couple things happened for me. I saw Nyx Bloom Ancient, and I was actually playing some Standard at the time. I realized I could combine it with Wake Root Elemental from M19 to make infinite mana, because Wake Root Elemental's ability, pay 5 green, untap target land you control, becomes a 5/5 elemental creature with haste. It's still a land. It does not specify that it has to be a non-creature land. So you can untap the same land multiple times. So, if your land taps for 6, then you go infinite. And there was a couple. I could do that with Sasaya, but then I could also do that with Nyx Bloom Ancient, and any other card that makes a forest tap for 2. So, with that in my head, that deck it went in an entirely different direction. But the second thing that happened when Theros Beyond Death came out is I saw Klothys, God of Destiny. I still had my Ruickthar build at the time, and the thing I ended up liking the most about Ruickthar was my ability to play cards like Wildfire and Force. Yeah, it was Force of. No, sorry, Destructive Force. There we go. Wildfire and Destructive Force, because they left my important permanent alive and destroyed most of the others. And I realized Klothys is Gruul, makes mana, and is indestructible as a commander. So I thought, okay, I can go and make my win condition these mass land destruction spells. I can break the symmetry on them. And that's how the Klothys Apocalypse deck was born. And it did really well right off the bat, because it had the same ramp, it had the same win condition as Ruickthar. But Klothys was more efficient, and it had more disruption. At the time, graveyard disruption was pretty important as well.
Yeah, and just as a fun fact, when we did go to Vegas, before we leave the Moltani part of the story behind,
Oh yeah,
Moltani was the deck that we played against some of the content creators, like the Spike Feeders, and playing with Power with Ryan there.
yeah, it was, and it was really fun to show that off and have it be respected at the table.
Yeah, because while I personally think Moltani was caught in this really unfortunate spot of being way too strong for casual, but being just not fast enough for cEDH, meaning it didn't really have a format. I still think it was super cool that you invented something that just no one had even remotely thought of with Sasaya.
Yeah, I was.
And I think that's what the big difference is between me and Sakaven in the way we design decks. Is I don't care if I take someone else's deck and play that. I just want to perfect it. Whereas Sakaven has this drive to invent things, which
That
is
I
where
do.
Moltani came from. And then the few decks after that. Well, Klothys was the next one, and Klothys, well, I don't consider is tier 0 or 1. Maybe it scratches tier 1.5, maybe not. but it is 100% a cEDH deck, unlike what I consider Multani to be, which is like barely not enough. And
Yeah.
yeah, that is basically no. There was one more deck you played before you. No, there were two more. Before you moved out and we no longer play face to face here.
Yeah,
There's a few more steps in
there
our
are a few more
evolution.
steps. Yep. I
Uh,
which one was next?
well, when we the next big step for us was actually attending this really big cEDH tournament after COVID had hit. It was remote.
Oh yeah. That was
Oh, what the heck was
after
it called?
it was called the hold on, I still have it on my Discord feed. The Time Twisted cEDH tournament.
There we go. And it had a lot of players that, for those of us who are well affiliated with the cEDH scene, you tend to see the good players popping up in one tournament and the next. And a good few of them were at this tournament. So this was our first big exposure to what was the real cEDH metagame here in the United States, at least, and actually with a handful of um, players from other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, and I registered a Shia. This was right after um, Zendikar Rising was spoiled. Well, came out and the cards are printed. I played a Shia because I quickly realized when a Shia was printed that because Prince here had played Yisan off and on this whole time. Um,
Ah, true.
yeah, we forgot to mention that. I realized that Quirion Ranger's ability gets broken when a Shia is in play because Quirion Ranger becomes a forest and can now use itself to pay its own cost to untap a creature you control and generate infinite mana really, really easily. And so I thought, okay, I can use a Shia as the commander, put as much ramp in here as I can, use the same draw spells I used in Multani, because a Shia is also naturally large. Its power is equal to the number of lands you control, which is the number of lands you control plus the number of creatures you control, because of the nature of her ability. So that I thought it was new, it was really powerful, could win on turn 2. Had some disruption because they've been giving green a lot of instant speed, interaction, endurance. That one's recently though. And so I wanted to enter that into the tournament rather than Klothys at the time.
Right, right. And I remember being exposed to just how cutthroat cEDH pods really are, because for so many of those games, I was so close to winning, and I think so were you, based
Yeah,
on
I
what we would
was.
share from our pods. But that's the thing with cEDH. The beauty is that you're always just a hair away from getting there. But there's just so much interaction and so much speed in this format that it's really hard to control. Um, First of all, it's hard not to misplay, not to be able to see everything at once and understand exactly what the implication of every action taken and every action not taken actually is. And I remember looking back at some of those games and saying, "Oh, if I had just done this instead of this, I would have been okay." But this was the first time we were really sitting at pods with four really good players, not just players with good decks, or not just good players with a deck, but four good players with really good decks. And it was noticeable. I couldn't win in the same ways that I have won traditionally over my history.
Yeah, neither could I. And I did. One of my losses was on a misplay. I remember I just forgot to attack this person that was really low and kill them, and they ended up, storming off the turn after.
Right.
Even though I had my win on board, it was things like that that
Yeah.
really taught me that I still have things to learn about this format, and I still have I still have things to invent and
Exactly.
still have things to experiment with.
That's why, and here's what my biggest takeaway was of that tournament, because I had heard this before the tournament when players talked about their decks, even decks that weren't good, considered good in the meta at that time. They would say that their biggest advantage is how well they know the meta, how well they know their decks, and how well they know their opponent's decks. And even though I knew that, I didn't really understand it at the fullest level until I played that tournament, because it wasn't the power of my deck that held me back. Oh, by the way, we never mentioned, but this was a proxy-friendly tournament, so you could basically play whatever you wanted, if I'm
Yeah,
not mistaken.
there was no budget on this one.
Yeah, yeah, I thought so. So definitely, the weakness was not the power level of my deck. It was the fact that I wasn't experienced enough to be able to detect all the nuances that were going on, whereas other people around me somewhat were. And that's why I think experience in cEDH is the biggest contributor to your win percentage.
Yeah, and since that time, I've been finding ways to play as often as I possibly can, whether that be on webcam or at a game store. Have the rule zero say, "Hey, I'm playing cEDH. It's the only way I play. Is there anyone here who can play?" And
Yeah, that was really cool.
I remember
We met
because
some really cool.
I ended up only playing cEDH because I try to invent deck after deck for casual play. And every time I build a deck, it is naturally too optimized for casual play. I built I built a Karametra God of Harvest deck, and Field of the Dead was my win condition. And I just the way I played it maybe or the way I built it was in such a way where I was prepared for every eventuality. I could win the game eventually almost every time.
You know, what was funny about that era, it was just a few months long when we tried to build just really good casual decks. And I remember coming to the conclusion that in a world where you do not go infinite, Field of the Dead rules the meta. Which, if you tell that to a casual player, they'll be like, "What? Huh? No, you just build a deck and you go with it."
Yeah,
But
what meta?
whenever we played against casual decks, oh, by the way, I made a oh gosh, I don't know the name of this card because I just know its Godzilla form is Biolante,
Oh,
but it's an Obzan card.
Nethroy.
Thank you. So I just built a good Obzan deck, and I put Field of the Dead in, and no one could win Casual Pause except for me or Sakaven. And everyone was so confused. It was like, what? Why is Field of the Dead all of a sudden so good? I'd never heard of this card before. But it's just because we're so used to analyzing exactly what happens in the game and being like, oh, you can't win with the probability of winning with this is just so much higher than winning with this. You have backup plan A and you have the best backup plan B, and that's it. Which is so crazy to indicate that the cEDH mindset translates over to casual to the point where even if you're playing a deck with no infinite power or no infinite combos, sorry, you still steamroll everyone because cEDH is half deck power, half mentality.
Yeah, I might nudge that it's more than half mentality. We're gonna release a video soon about misconceptions around surrounding cEDH, the term, how people use it or misuse it, and what really defines the mindset and the decks and the meta. And maybe
Yeah,
that'll
stay
serve as a
tuned for that one.
better, more thorough introduction to it. I know other content creators have touched upon it in the context of answering complaints or answering major misconceptions and events that happen, like bannings. But we'll be going over everything that has to do with the term, how to define it, how to recognize whether you need to play it or normal commander or where that where the true line is, because there is a line. I've hovered it twice with that Karametra deck and with Multani where I'm like too powerful to play in casual. My friends actively tell me not to do it, not to play those decks, and yet I don't feel comfortable putting them at a cEDH table.
Right.
Now we can move on to our next topic.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're basically one step away from our present states in terms of our history, but we probably have an episode coming about Selvala Explorer Returned,
Yeah,
if I'd venture to guess.
yeah, because
So
I
we
built
can
it in a
save that for
slightly
a later day.
different way than you see from like the Twiddle Storm variant, because I'm relying heavily on Ashaya, using that as a combo rather than a storm win condition. Frees up a lot of slots, allows me to be more of a mid range strategy. So
Right.
that'll be coming. I'll also do a video on Klothys because it's unique and interesting.
Sure.
And now you've recently adopted you've been playing Thrasios Tymna for a long time at this point.
Yeah,
Recently,
it's a good deck to just always come back to.
yeah, the colors are great and the commanders aren't, you know, they're not ingrained in your win condition. They're just there to be good.
For sure, for sure. And part of the reason that I play decks that are more mainstream, because I do experiment with a lot of decks. I get some proxies together and try. Let's try Zur for today. Let's try this cool um, Opus Thief list. And I experiment with a lot of things. And part of that reason was because I had a lot of friends who like to experiment with either their own deck creations or decks that were a little fringe. And so I wanted to bring a deck that was more representative of the meta to become a better testing partner and just to be able to study the meta a little better from the inside. So yeah, I never really branched out too far from the norm, but that creates a nice little, I guess, variety between me and my testing partner Sakaven.
Yeah, it was a good dynamic that trained us both in ways that will be useful in the future. Just
Agreed.
remembering all the effects in play, understanding what your opponent can have or can't have in their hand, what resources they have access to. So, other videos we have planned to release. We'll be doing this podcast every other week, probably on Thursdays. We'll we'll release some gameplay footage from our own play group. I've got a couple friends I met down here in Jacksonville who play cEDH with us. We'll do deck techs on our interesting, notable decks. Also the meta lists with changes that need explanation, strategy and articles, and we'll do our just cEDH related videos, like the Misconceptions video that's coming out later next week. And then we'll have tournament performance analysis whenever we attend online or in person, so that we can give a proper report on the performance of our decks to the wider audience. Because I know that content creators, they do gameplay all the time, but they often change it up. They play a deck once, and it's interesting, but we had the idea of really putting every deck to the grindstone to see what it's capable of and what consistency it can bring in terms of results. So that's where our channel will be focused. Speaking of, I've been grinding on mainly the Discord server related to r/competitive EDH on Reddit, and Selvala Power Rangers is what I call the deck because of the Quirion Ranger and Scrib Ranger. That deck has been performing great. So far, I've gotten 7 games in, only lost 1, and the list has been updated like 3 times since I started playing there. But each time, I think I've gotten closer to what the ideal strategy would be with this commander. Now,
Yeah,
I wouldn't call the Reddit thread an established meta, but the people who play there are strictly competitive in their mindset.
yeah.
One thing I noticed is that Emil's broken. I love that card. Unicorns for days. it it allows me to repeat effects that are way too powerful to be repeated for 3 mana at instant speed, like Solitude, like endurance like Eternal Witness. Gives me an alternate win condition with its interaction with Village Bellringer and any number of mana dorks. I actually got so interested in the Unicorn that I tried brewing a list with Emil as the commander. It didn't work out for cEDH. It just wasn't as good. But it was a really fun thought experiment.
For sure. One of the things that I wouldn't personally try, but you never really know what can come of it.
Yeah. And as far as what we've seen from other content creators recently, very huge focus on Ad Nauseam right now. Playing with
Seems
powers,
to be the card to beat.
Yeah, most recent podcast was all about Ad Nauseam and how it's prevalent right now, what it does. Because there's decks, we've got Cody, we've got Ikra Krom, we've got Rograk Silas. All of those are just turbo Ad Naus, throw it down as fast as you can. We're talking turn 1 and 2. One of the things they mentioned that I thought was really interesting was that the decks sacrificed their card quality to induce speed. Like their individual card quality is not as high as it used to be for decks running Ad Nauseam, but now they're way faster. So they're not as prepared for the long game. But even discounting the ban of Hullbreacher, which did speed the meta up a little bit, stacks is really hard to do. There are a lot of stacks players, but there is so much interaction now, so much free interaction, that you can punch an Ad Nauseam through pretty consistently.
It's like the Yu-Gi-Oh! Hand traps all over again.
It is.
We're definitely going to plan to do some testing on what strategies work specifically in faster metas like Ad Nauseam, in contrast to what it looks like in pods where Ad Nauseam maybe isn't so prevalent, to really give the perspective of how well a deck performs when the meta changes a little bit, or if it's just a good strategy in general, etc., etc. That's something that we really look forward to doing in the future.
For sure. And another thing that's really prevalent right now is Underworld Breach. Big focus on that card. I don't think it's necessarily a ban-worthy card, because for the reasons we outlined before, that it's not going to ruin a casual game. But the card enables every other combo. It lets you cast Ad Nauseam, put an Underworld Breach into play, reuse your free rituals, and your Lotus Petal, your Dockside Extortionist with Reanimate. Make a lot of mana, win the game. Usually you end up on a Thassa's Oracle combo. Even though you're playing Breach, even though you're playing Ad Nauseam, you still win via Thassa's Oracle, which is fine. At this point, it's less of a win condition and more of a card that requires pre-existing conditions to win you the game, that you play in a deck that storms off to get it into play. And I think it's an interesting little shift, because right when that card was spoiled, people were like, ooh, I'm just going to play a bunch of tutors and grab this and this 2-piece combo. Hey, I win. Free counter spells. Yay. But now there's so much interaction and so much speed that somebody's going to go off with Ad Nauseam before you have the chance to get your 3 mana, before you have the chance to build up and sculpt a hand that wins with those 2 cards.
Yeah, that is kind of crazy.
And so the meta's fast right now, but stacks is viable on the back of some really powerful effects that hurt Ad Nauseam. Deafening Silence is one of the best because it costs 1 mana, can stop them from winning. They need to cast multiple spells. And many more. But one of the reasons I said that the mindset might carry more than just 1 part weight in the cEDH identity is because someone can go and pilot Heliod and pilot it in such a way that they can top 4 or win tournaments, because they know how to play it very well. They know how to attack the meta really well. They know how to anticipate, politic, and play their cards in such a way that they will win the game. that mindset needs to be brought into cEDH in order for the game to be healthy and enjoyable for everyone. It's often said that cEDH's rule zero is that there is no rule zero. What do you make of that statement, Prince?
Um, yeah, rule zero is this term that I've heard a lot recently, but not so much before this last month. What do you see as rule zero to begin with?
Rule zero is it's supposed to be a discussion that the commander players have before they start their pod or their night to
Right, okay.
establish
So,
their like house rules, what they want to see in a game, what sorts of power levels, although power level is really hard to determine, what sorts of deck styles they're willing to play against and willing to play. Like, are we gonna? It's the difference between sitting down and saying, okay, I want everybody to play creatures, biggest ones win, or I need everybody to be playing blue because I really like interactive games. Things like that encompass the rule zero discussion.
okay, yeah, that was a pretty good explanation. Yeah, I completely agree, actually. The draw to cEDH is that the format is its own rule zero. Everyone comes in kind of expecting what everyone's going to play, and that's a lot of that has to do with the identity that is cEDH in the first place, which we'll touch on a lot on the episode about the misconceptions. But that's honestly why I like it. It's because it solves a problem that the rest of Commander has that we don't over here, and that's what I appreciate the most about the format. Actually, is you don't have to have a conversation about what's allowed, what's not. You just skip straight to the game.
Yeah, it. I like that definition that our rule zero is defined. It's set in stone. You like we play to win within the rules of Magic, using whatever cards are available, as efficiently as and as correctly as possible. We're not here to like a cEDH player is never there to like just show off their bling or just play an interesting tribal strategy, tell a story. The stories we tell are in the plays that we make. They're not in the cards that we choose for our decks. And the plays that we make we expect the game to be interactive. We expect no one to be able to just do it. Because we all sit at the table and we understand that pretty much, well, we don't understand necessarily that anything could happen at any moment, but we understand the things that could happen at any moment. For instance, we play a land untapped and pass if we don't have anything to do on turn one. There's no sense in playing tapped lands in cEDH because we come to play cheap, efficient interaction, or even just bluff that we have it. And those are the things that every strictly competitive player already understands. We don't need to say it before the game starts. It's really one thing I enjoy about cEDH is I can just sit down with people. I know they're cEDH players, play our commanders, decide who goes first, and start playing, no questions asked. I don't need to have a gauntlet of 15 decks to play cEDH. I can just play my one or two and play them until they're dead.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that sums up our philosophies of how we think cEDH, what we think it should be as a format, and how we enjoy playing it as well. So that's going to be, those are the same kind of principles that we're going to take to every opinion we have and every gameplay video that we release in the future.
Yeah, and with that, do you have anything else to add for this episode?
Not really, just that now we're not really at this point used to making these types of episodes, so we probably did a lot of things that were not as effective as they could be. So if anyone listening to this could please give us any feedback, that would be awesome, and we'll try and shape these talks a little more toward what people actually want to hear rather than just the things that we have to say.
Yeah, and I'm Sakaven on the internet. You can find me on Discord and YouTube and Reddit. Um, Prince as well, Prince of Asphodel.
Right. I'm basically known as Prince of Asphodel on any platform that I'm in, Reddit, Discord, you name it. I don't have too much of a platform as of now, but I'm starting to build one and starting to get some name recognition out there. Like I said, we were hoping to make some names for ourselves in this format, but we'll definitely keep working on this because I think it's a beautiful format and expanding it really can help a lot of people out there who maybe don't feel like they've found a format that suits them.
Yeah, we love how much it's growing, and we're excited to help in that growth. So we'll see y'all in
Absolutely.
a couple weeks for episode 2. Thanks
Take
for
care.
joining me, Prince. Yeah, take care.